Hello, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you might be. This is the Apollo Detectives. It's November 2021 and we are back. I am Ben Emlyn-Jones and I'm joined by my three colleagues here. It's just the three of us at the moment, but others will be joining us in other productions. It is Neil Geddes-Ward. Hello, Neil.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Marcus. Hi, Rasa. Good to be back. We've been a while, so it's good to catch up with everybody.
You too. And we have Mr. Nexus himself, Marcus Allen. How are you, Marcus?
I'm well, thank you. We just got the new edition of Nexus out. It'll be on the newsstand next week.
Oh, great. I've just finished reading the previous one. It's very interesting.
It is.
And all the way from China, we have Rasa Vihari once again for his second visit, I believe. Hello, Rasa.
Hello. We're celebrating the recent Chang'e mission and the rocks which were brought back, which were different from the Apollo rocks.
Ah, yes, that's right. Maybe we'll get into that because, of course, China has been having a lot of success in its moon missions at the moment. So I'm sure that's very interesting. Also, we have coming up the Artemis mission, apparently, which is a manned rocket which is going to launch to the moon sometime. It's going to be 2024. Now it's not. Guess we'll find out. But anyway, it's going to be a great show. So thank you, everyone, for watching. Keep watching. There's more coming up.
So getting back to the Artemis one, before we do some presentations here, I've been following the Artemis thing loosely. I know they've been trying to assemble everything and test rockets, and they've had issues with spacesuits. I think presumably these are the problems that are holding it up. Initially, they had this window of 2024 to try and get everything up there. They now thought that was a bit ambitious, so have now put it back to 2025. Any kind of updates or any more information on that, anybody?
The one which is being delayed is Artemis 3. So Artemis 2 is not being delayed, and actually Artemis 2 is the one to watch. They still got it announced that the May 2024 Artemis 2. The reason Artemis 2 is important is because they're going to send human beings around the moon. The one which is being delayed is the landing flight. That's being pushed off to 2025. I want to see Artemis 2 because if they can actually go around the moon, then, we're going to have to look at what kind of radiation shielding they have.
Yeah, well, Apollo 8 apparently managed it in 1968, so we'll wait. We'll have to see. I mean, I'm sure if Scott were here, he'd be telling us about the seals on the spacesuit and about whether they work in the vacuum of space. I'm sure he'll have a lot to say about that in a future show. But no, I thought there was just one mission. I didn't know there was more than one. But of course, a mission orbiting the moon, would it be like Apollo 8? It would actually go into lunar orbit and then come back again.
It's called the Powerhouse. It was assembled in Europe, and they just sent it over on a plane to America. And the Powerhouse is the radiation shielding chamber for the Artemis 2 mission. And they are not releasing information. What is that square box the astronauts live inside, called the Powerhouse, because all of the environmental controls are inside that box. And you don't find much information, like what are the sides of the ship made out of. It's probably some kind of a bizarre 3D printed material, which is what Tesla is doing in their Starship, their manned mission.
I mean, there's several materials. I mean, we know that like plastic can protect from alpha and beta particles. You need heavy metals to protect against gamma rays, which of course are very heavy. Things like lead, very heavy, and they add it's a lot of complication to the mission if they have to launch a payload that large. Yet,
let me just say that it's also very interesting because the recent SpaceX that flew the non-astronauts.
Yeah.
So that was the highest flight that human beings have ever taken. A lot of people don't realize that. The previous record was when the space shuttle went to fix the Hubble telescope. So that Hubble telescope, that was 559 kilometers. So that was the previous record. And now this Crew Dragon, flight number 2, was 580 kilometers. So they went farther than the previous records. And how did they do that? Okay, Elon Musk has a lot of secrets about how his spaceship is made, but I was able to dig up a few things. So the inner cavity of the spaceship is made out of a special 3D printed material called Inconel. It's this very special chemical mixture that's being 3D printed, specially designed prevent radiation. And then the space suits themselves are also made out of a special material they invented called Nomex. And that material also, they measure the people's body and they 3D print the suit to fit all their joints perfectly. Because the space suit itself is made out of a special material for protecting from radiation, so it's very special, top secret materials they're using in both the spaceship and the space suit. And that's just to get them up 580 kilometers.
I was wondering if perhaps Marcus could comment on this. I was wondering about the solar season we're in at the moment, because we're actually out of the solar minimum now. We're now going up towards the solar maximum. Does that affect, for example, solar radiation, of course, is affected, but also galactic cosmic rays, X-ray, gamma, neutron, that kind of thing?
Those are the most dangerous parts of what humans will meet in space. Whether it can be protected, I mean, Russ has explained it very well in terms of what they have used on SpaceX, but how much testing has been done with SpaceX and humans in space? They can see the problem, they can see that it has to be solved, and they're desperately trying to solve it. Whether they are doing it the right way, whether they will actually protect anything, because going up 500 kilometers is not even touching the lower Van Allen belts. Those are about 600 miles, best part of 1,000 kilometers. So they haven't really got into any unpleasant areas of space. Now, whether they're going to or not, let alone launch anything through the Van Allen belts, because it takes 2 hours to launch through them, I don't know. And by now, with Apollo, they had already launched Apollo 8 on lunar orbit. And they'd obviously found that it wasn't a problem because they then continued to do it. Apollo 9 didn't go into the Van Allen belts, Apollo 10 did, and so on down. So obviously something worked for Apollo, or we've been persuaded to believe that something worked. Now, if SpaceX believed that Apollo solved the problem, and they're now trying to duplicate what Apollo did, they may well have a major problem on their hands in trying to duplicate what Apollo did over 50 years ago. 1968, Apollo 8, December 1968. It's a strange time we live in, because people are continually saying, oh, it's no problem, we can just fly out there, we can protect our astronauts from all the dangers of space, but they haven't actually got the parameters of what the dangers are. Have they sent craft through the Van Allen belts to measure the levels of radiation? Now, they'll say that they have, but I have never found any testing that's been done.
The only ones we know of, there was sounded by Explorer 1, I think there may have been others, but certainly a full survey of the radiation. There's never been its intensity, the height of the belt, how thick they are, things like that.
It should be mentioned that prior to 2012, we knew almost nothing about the Van Allen belts. It wasn't until the Van Allen probes went up in 2012, and there were 2 probes measuring the belts by sending signals through the belts. Then we started to get a picture of what really the Van Allen belts are.
The official explanation as well, they went through the belts very quickly, but in terms of Apollo 8 and the later missions, the manned missions that went to the moon, allegedly, they didn't know at that time they were taking a huge risk with those astronauts.
Yeah, exactly. Have the Chinese, in their more recent launches into lunar orbit, have they been testing the Van Allen belts as they've gone through them? Have they been measuring? If they've got the figures, obviously they're not releasing them because it would conflict with Apollo.
Exactly. They're not going to blow the whistle on Apollo like that.
No, exactly.
Which is funny, because in recent times, the talk of how to protect from the cosmic radiation is increasing. There's a TEDx. This is a very delicate subject because you're on the verge of blowing the whistle on NASA.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how they're kind of dodging that subject of talking about radiation but not blowing the whistle on NASA.
Yeah.
Now, wasn't it Bart Sibrel was trying to get information about the radiation tests that were done recently, or was it something to do with the sun? And he said that they wouldn't release the information about what was the power of the radiation emanating from the sun because it was classified. And he said, how can something be classified as part of nature? I remember something about that.
Yeah, that's actually described in his book, Moon Man.
Yeah.
I mean, surely wouldn't they just publish them? I mean, the Soviets used to publish their data. I mean, for the whole scientific community.
There are enough people around who can analyze that information and work out how humans have to be protected. 50 years ago, that wasn't possible because we didn't have the information. We didn't know what was going on. We were told, oh, they just traveled through the Van Allen belts very fast, so we weren't affected. 2 hours of exposure to the radiation levels in the Van Allen belts and beyond, people tend to forget it's not just the Van Allen belts that cause the problem. It's all the space beyond them on the way to the moon. That's full of radiation.
As you put it once in your program with John Ronson, Marcus, you're naked before creation. We know that there's solar radiation during the solar maximum, which reaches a high intensity. X-ray, the flares release a lot of X-rays, which are very, very dangerous. They can kill you easily. And then, of course, there's the solar minimum, but then you have galactic cosmic rays, which become more intense during the solar minimum.
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of diagrams for designs for spacecraft, little kids' books. I got the Osborne Guide to Space Exploration or something like that when I was a little kid. It showed a design for a deep spacecraft for journeys to the moon and planets and things like that. It had something inside it called a storm cellar, which is basically a chamber surrounded by heavy metals and tanks of water, which astronauts could go into during a coronal mass ejection. Kim Stanley Robinson, in his Mars trilogy, in the story which takes the astronauts Mars, has that structure within it. Indeed, it has to be used at one point during the mission.
In the recent TV series that they're showing them hiding in the cave, when the radiation comes, they have to run to the cave. That's another option. But I wanted to mention, you were talking about the galactic radiation versus the solar radiation. And yes, what you said was correct. When it's a solar maximum, the solar winds actually block out a little bit of the cosmic radiation. So to NASA's favor, we can say, okay, actually it's almost better to go during the solar maximum. But either way, the whole idea is ridiculous because, a kind of deadly radiation is a little bit better than this kind of deadly radiation. So it's like, you're going to die either way.
That's why I do my space weather reports on my radio show, Hapanmo show, to monitor this sort of thing. That's one of the reasons I do it. And I know that during the solar maximum, coronal mass ejections, which is like a billion hydrogen bombs going off all at once and then flying towards you, these things can happen randomly at any time. Really, people shouldn't buy NASA's line. The line is basically, well, we were kind of lucky, or we had a plan, we just rotate the spacecraft a bit and that would be enough. It's easy to say that afterwards, isn't it?
I think it's an interesting point about the rotation of the spacecraft, the barbecue thing that they often refer to, where they're on their way to the moon, they're supposedly rotating the craft to get the heat sort of absorbed equally on all sides and things, which sounds a moderately, scientific principle to use. But when they've actually landed on the moon, and this is in case of Apollo 17, they're like 3 days on the moon or something, how can you possibly rotate the lunar module?
I suppose, what I would do if I was planning this mission, I'd say to the guys in the spacesuits, you're going to have to go and stand in the shadow every so often for a little while and cool off. Because you have this big contrast on the moon between light and dark, between where the sun shines, it's very hot, it's 80 degrees centigrade. Where there's shadow, it's like minus 119 or something like that, minus 120. So you'd be protected for a short time because no thermal insulation is perfect, and sooner or later you're going to get hot in your spacesuit and you're going to have to cool down. Where do you go? You have to go and stand in the shadow.
I think it was Apollo 15, they put their space telescope there, so presumably to take shots of the night sky or something or other. So they were in there briefly to erect that up, but most of the time they're out playing golf.
If you stayed in the shadow too long, you'd start to get very, very cold indeed.
Yeah.
And,
you talked about this luck thing, NASA got lucky. And this just really cracks me up. This one debunker came into the group. He sent an article. I didn't even read it because it's so ridiculous, but it's called NASA got lucky. And they're talking about, I think it was Apollo 16. There was a solar flare just before Apollo 16 and the solar flare right after Apollo 16. So they got lucky. They were in between the two solar flares. It's such a ridiculous article.
Yeah. In fact, that was the conclusion reached. I attended a lecture at the British Interplanetary Society given by a scientist from the Harwell Nuclear Institute near Oxford who investigate these sort of things. And they were talking about radiation in space, and they were talking about protecting astronauts from the radiation in space. And they mentioned that solar flare. August the 4th, I think it was, 1972, between Apollo 16 and Apollo 17. And actually I asked them, I said, how were they protected from the problems of radiation in space? Because they seemed to duck through it. And her answer was, it was the luck of Apollo. That's what they're relying on. And that's probably where that remark came from.
It's easy to say that afterwards. When everyone's home, they're also, even there was no major malfunctions. Apollo 13 was the only major malfunction, and even that ended happily, which was incredible. It's not so easy to say that beforehand when you're planning the mission, and you know everything's going to be on TV. If something goes wrong, everyone's going to know about it. If they die, it'll be televised.
Well, this is the thing. The luck of Apollo seemed to work very well for the ships getting there and coming back again. But anyone who spoke out against Apollo during that time did not seem to have the luck of Apollo. They seemed to have the reverse. So you got Gus Grissom and his colleagues. They started to speak out, or certainly Gus Grissom did. So he did not have the luck of Apollo on his side at that point. Then you got Thomas Barron, who, again, given a press conference and talking about the mishaps of Apollo and things like that. And unfortunately, he did not have the luck of Apollo. And he came to a very unfortunate end with his family at a railroad crossing, which someone said was the train was actually that hit the car was owned by NASA. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard.
The car just happened to break down on a level crossing. I mean, that's...
Yeah.
Here's a question for all the people who think Apollo 13 was real. How many Apollo 13 command modules are on display, public display in America right now? 2. The one in London is the Apollo 10 command module. The Apollo 13 official command module is on display at the Kansas Cosmodrome. But also the Grand Rapids Museum have another Apollo 13 command module. And it's on public display, and it's been sealed for 100 years. It was put on display in 1976. It was going to be sealed for 100 years to the 300th anniversary of founding of America. What's it doing there if it's the official command module? I don't know if it is the official command module. People will say it's the boilerplate version that was fished out of the Atlantic by the Soviet Navy the day after Apollo 13 launched and returned to America 6 months later. It just seems a very odd story because nobody had said there was a command module missing. It would be a danger to shipping. They're quite big. They weigh about 7 or 8 tons, floating around in the Atlantic. And that's a long way from Florida, and it's definitely way off course for any Apollo mission, because that would go out over Africa. It wouldn't go out over the Bay of Biscay, which is where it was found. So the Soviet Navy hauled it out of the sea, took it back to their base in Murmansk in northern Russia, handed it back to America, who put it on display 4 years later. What's going on?
If there are 2 that claim to be the Apollo 13 command module, and the command module is the only part of the entire Saturn rocket that ever comes back to Earth.
Yeah.
That's the only bit. That's the bit with the people and the pressure hull and the people. You can't really make a mistake about which one's which. You shouldn't be able to. It should be very obvious because we know when they land. We know they're fished out at the sea. The astronauts are taken aboard this aircraft carrier. One of the command modules sank.
Yeah.
Luckily, the astronauts did get out before the thing sank. I think it was a Gemini, One of the Gemini sank, and it was lost, but the astronauts luckily did get out in time.
2 points I'd like to raise about that. One about the Apollo 13 capsule supposedly taken to Russia is that if you've got it in Russia for 4 months, you can bet your bottom dollar the KGB or whoever has gone over it with a fine tooth comb to have a good look at it and take down the technical details. Possibly, I only say possibly, it's just a hypothetical, they might have placed something on it, recording equipment, maybe bugs or whatever, so that when it's returned to the Americans, they could record secret conversations inside the capsule. Maybe they wouldn't want to lose that opportunity. Maybe.
Right now, they're trying to dive down and pick up the jet from the aircraft carrier that sank the other day. Yeah.
Always quick to retrieve these things. The Americans do the same things with the Russian aircraft as well. I've heard cases where they've stolen aircraft, the inspiration for the Firefox film, with Clint Eastwood. But the thing about the Apollo capsules coming backwards, they're coming back at like 25,000 miles per hour backwards. They don't have a steering wheel, and somehow they always land within about 4 miles of the aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And according to the book One Small Step by the German author, is that all the previous Gemini and similar missions, they always landed way off course. I mean, even the Russians have landed off course when they've returned to Earth. Some of them ended up in China. Apollo missions coming backwards, they can't see out the window. They somehow managed to backflip and land right slap bang next to the aircraft carrier. I mean, that's the equivalent of me being blindfolded, holding a dart, throwing it over my shoulder and hitting a bullseye every time, 6 times, really.
There's a documentary about Tim Peake, about his mission up into the International Space Station. He came back on a Soyuz capsule, and so they land on land, but there's a helicopter is needed to go and pick them up, because they come down in a remote part of Kazakhstan, near the Cosmodrome, near the space center there. They can't hit it on the nose every time. There's usually like about, I think it's like 100 square mile margin of error or something like that. Marcus, you probably know more about that.
For any spacecraft to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, especially coming back from lunar orbit, as you say, they are entering the Earth's atmosphere, which is only 30, 40 miles up by the time they hit the atmosphere. They have to enter it at 6.5 degrees to the surface of the Earth, so that they will come in and they will burn off the speed with the heat, and it produces an enormous amount of heat. So if they're coming back over land, they don't have any option to change direction. They have to continue on the path that they have set themselves. Now, one of the problems of re-entering at that sort of speed is they come in, they bounce off the atmosphere to slow down the craft so that they can come in at a slightly slower angle. But by bouncing off the atmosphere, which is quite a common thing to do, they then lose track of where they are, because how far do they bounce off and how far do they then travel? Depends on the speed. So there's a continual problem with finding out where the actual re-entered spacecraft is. The first nation to actually do a return from lunar orbit was the Soviet Union with Zond 5, where they returned these animals. That was the first time it had ever happened. Apollo 8 was much later than that. So they had to try to work out how to get the spacecraft back from lunar orbit. The spacecraft don't have brakes. As you say, they don't have steering wheels either. But it's basically hit and miss. Are they going to get the right angle? If skip re-entry is done properly, yes, it will reduce the speed to the point where it can be controlled. Now, Apollo didn't do skip re-entry. They couldn't handle it. They didn't have the technology to deal with it. So all Apollo craft came back with direct entry, straight into the atmosphere, slow down, parachutes out, into the sea, collected big heroes. Now, whether that's correct or not, or whether they just dropped out of an aircraft sort of 5 or 6 miles up, because you wouldn't actually see an aircraft at 5 miles up, 30, 40,000 feet up. It's like trying to see somebody on the top of Mount Everest, that's 30,000 feet. Highly unlikely you will.
It would explain if they really were landing within like 4 miles of the USS Hornet or whatever aircraft carrier they were using. If you're dropping something like a command module with parachutes from that altitude, you probably could get within 4 miles of your target, depending on wind direction. But you get wind direction's another problem. All these factors have to be taken into account.
Yes.
But you could do it quite accurately from a high-flying aircraft. So what was it, guys? I mean, this is the question. Were those command modules really flying straight back from the moon, or were they dropped from a high-flying aircraft?
In the documentary by Aaron Rainin, Did We Go? He went to the boat, the guy who met the astronauts when they first opened the door, and he interviewed that guy. And they did have a radar on that ship to track when the command module first entered. He interviewed that guy to find out whether that guy was lying or not. Did you really see the astronauts? And his conclusion was that guy is not a liar. So, if you think about the compartmentalization thing, some people were in on the hoax and some people were not, right? The people who were in on the hoax, their job was to convince the people who were not in on the hoax. And if there are some guys sitting on the ship and they can track the thing coming down from space, as far as they know, it came from the moon. But whether it came from just low Earth orbit, they would have no idea.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'd have to have real astronauts in the command module. I mean, they'd have to put people in there to make it convincing. Because then if they didn't, everyone on the ship would know that there was something amiss.
Yeah.
And
It's
that
also
would be-
interesting, again, the case of Apollo 17, who were presumably out there for a lot longer, like 10 days or something out in space and on the moon and things like that, is that they come back and they step onto the aircraft carrier with no problems of gravity. They acclimatized to gravity pretty much straight
Yeah,
away.
that's, the Soyuz astronauts can't do that. They have
That's
to
right, they have
carry
to
it.
sit in chairs. And exactly. I mean, I know that a lot of these Soyuz people have been in space for like 6 months and things like that, which is perfectly understandable. But let's take an example. When you go on a fairground and you're being whizzed around on something for maybe 5 minutes ride or something, and then you get off, you're a little bit dizzy on your feet. Well, certainly I am. Now, I know these Apollo astronauts have been spun around and all sorts of things, but still, you would have some sort of problem with gravity once you've been in space for 10 days.
You could argue that the astronauts on the ISS, they're up there for 6 months at a time, and so their body acclimatizes to low gravity.
William
Soyuz, isn't
Shatner got sick.
it? Did he? Oh, dearie me.
The other guy that went with him got killed in an aircraft crash like less than a week after their flight. It's quite a weird thing that all these people that go into space and they make these missions and then a lot of them die afterwards of something so straightforward.
Yuri Gagarin did, didn't
Yeah,
he?
exactly.
It was,
Yeah.
Again, plane crash. It does indicate something. With William Shatner, he threw up. Now he was only in microgravity for 10 minutes because it wasn't. He didn't go into orbit. It was a parabolic flight. It was a ballistic trajectory. He just went up and came down. He's only in microgravity 10 minutes, and then he had to get back into the seat for re-entry. But even that short time disorientated his balance system so much that he ended up feeling nausea. And I know a lot of people on the Vomit Comet do. And that's literally, you get like about 1.5 minutes of microgravity for every single stoop that the aircraft does. If someone's just going to get out of a capsule, wave to everyone as they're getting on the little rubber dinghy, and it should make people ask questions. You know, they're not even wobbling, they're not even staggering.
Yeah.
They're walking
Yeah.
normally.
Earlier, he was talking about a museum issue. So Apollo 17 was when the tire flap broke off and they put a map on it, right? So the official story is that at the end of the mission, he grabbed the mat and he grabbed the broken tire flap and brought them back to Earth. And so they were sitting in a museum for a long, long time. There was a display in one museum saying, this is the map that he used, and this is the tire flap which broke off. And then people realized, wait a minute, if you look at the photos, the tire flap is this long, but the flap in the museum is only that long. It's a different flap from the one that was actually, you can see in the pictures, you know. So they got rid of that museum exhibition really quick.
Good point. And also, if they were using duct tape, which I believe they were to repair it, to put the map on, they had a bit of duct tape. Duct tape doesn't work in a vacuum. It's made of a liquid. So it would immediately outgas and the thing would fall off. And they expect us to believe that duct tape can work in a vacuum. NASA knows that it can't. They've actually done a report on it. The duct tape cannot work in a vacuum. So how did they fix that particular mudguard? It's a mystery. One more to add to the continual mysteries of Apollo.
Okay, so I wanted to share with you this little presentation, and it has what I call smoking guns. So before I start, I want to mention that the way I did this is the opposite from the way American Moon does it. American Moon starts with debunking the debunkers and then goes into the smoking guns. But I've turned that thing around, starting with the smoking guns and then finally the debunking. So like, for example, in the American Moon, they start off with the hardest question to answer. Why didn't the Russians blow the whistle? So they start off with the big debunking the debunkers. And I'm going to put that at the end, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to start off with the smoking guns first. Let me introduce this first smoking gun. So that's the video there called the docking. And in this video, you're seeing a clip of a toy, a Hollywood studio prop, because the antenna falls down due to gravity. So you can tell that they're in Earth's gravity. And the debunkers, you know, can't really debunk this one. They've tried, they said, oh, you've adjusted the speed. And it's like, no, this video comes directly from the, you know, NASA webpage. And when you watch it on YouTube, and all the documentaries have this exact same clip, and the speed is exactly matched to the audio. So if they try to like slow the film down so the thing falls slower and say, "Oh, it's not gravity," you can tell it won't work because then the video won't match the audio anymore. So this is one of the biggest smoking guns of them all. You know, there's really, if somebody has seen this, you know that they're faking it. So it's pretty hard to even believe in the moon landing anymore after just seeing one smoking gun. There's a couple problems with this video. So the first problem, it's not only the gravity is making the antenna fall, but another problem comes is when the craft is moving, but there's no exhaust plumes. So in space, if a ship is going to move or change the course, there has to be exhaust plumes coming out, right? So there's no exhaust plumes there in these ships. And why not? Because they're not real spaceships, you know?